Thank you very much, Sorin, and thank you very much, first of all, dear Excellencies, dear friends, for inviting me. Thank you to the many sponsors. It's my first time in Cluj, but I definitely will be back. I had a quick call with my wife yesterday and told her how nice the city was and how friendly the people were. So we'll definitely do an effort to be back and spend a little bit more time. Unfortunately, I will not be able to stay the entire conference today, but again, thank you for the opportunity for me to say a few words about how we see the situation of the European commercial airlines in Brussels. Before I do that, it's actually quite interesting that earlier this week at an event, a VIP event in Brussels, I bumped into EU Transport Commissioner Adina Vălean, who's of course the Romanian European Commissioner in Brussels. And when I told her that I was coming to this conference in Cluj, she says, the first thing is she says, you know, regional connectivity is very important. And she said this many times to me, but she repeated that, and I said, yes, you're absolutely right. I will stress that point again. So we know that, or you should know that in Brussels you have a commissioner from your country who is very supportive of the airline industry, who's very supportive of the aspect of regional connectivity that is very crucial also for this country, but for many regions across Europe. Right. With Airlines for Europe, indeed, we represent about more than 70% of passenger traffic in Europe. We haven't seen the latest calculations yet from last year, but I would imagine we're roughly up at the same level today. And we lobby for the interest of our airlines in front of the European institutions, but also some national authorities. So let me take you as the screen, see whether this works, and it does. Great, because you always have to check technology. This is, some of you may see this chart. This is the latest chart from Eurocontrol, which is forecasting airline traffic for the next couple of years, for the next 3 years. Things have not changed that much in the sense that if you look at the basic scenario, that it will take until 2024 until airlines are at the same level in terms of revenues to start with compared to 2019. So we always compare ourselves with 2019 because this was the last, so to say, normal year before COVID hit in. Now, a couple of maybe remarks to this. So let's hope we have the basic or a more positive scenario there. But let's take into account that it will take until 24 for us to be back at the 2019 levels across the board. We did a survey amongst the A4E members back in July about the COVID-19 impact on traffic, on their traffic. Now, this was, of course, based on data before this summer season. So you have to take that into account. And of course, it was not that great, the feedback we got back. I'll just state you a couple of numbers here. Almost 770 routes were cancelled due to COVID versus 2019. For instance, also that included the route Athens-Cluj, and there was a route Cluj-Gatwick that was cancelled. 612 routes are now being operated, now before the summer, operated by fewer airlines. I think some of you who travel a lot will actually have noticed that you have less choice when it comes to picking airlines. In most cases, many of these routes I just mentioned are served by one airline instead of 2 or 3 airlines. So the passenger has less choice to choose from. More than 800 routes before the summer had significantly fewer frequencies compared to 2019. And the regional and domestic connectivity thereby has been majorly affected by this reduction of the routes. I'm talking about domestic European traffic. I'm not even talking about international transatlantic traffic because those numbers would even look worse in my view. Now, there are some reasons for this. One is that about 3/4 of the inter-European traffic, inter-European fleet in service is consistent of large narrow bodies, which are too large for some of the market sizes. The second one is that some of these routes were among the lower performance already pre-COVID, to be honest, and some airlines have increased frequency, on the other hand, to destinations into Southern Europe, where the demand was higher, because when people, mostly from Northern Europe, want to travel again, post-COVID, they travel south, where the sun is, and not travel north. That's quite obvious, but that's also a factor. Many airlines have still, of course, not recovered, 100% at least, from pre-COVID capacity. There's a slower recovery of demand on the business side. So while we've seen demand and leisure travel, on the amount of leisure travel really boost, and again this summer, on the business side, the corporate travel, we're clearly not there yet. Again, this has had an impact on the route reduction. And we've seen some model shift in some countries, especially for domestic routes, model shift to high-speed rail, at least in those countries that have high-speed rail. I think you probably know which countries I'm talking about in Western Europe. And there's been some operational reasons also with the airlines, infrastructure bottlenecks, restructuring fleet, and so on. So a lot of messy things have been going on as well. Now, this was a survey from July. So as I said, this is a situation, impact of COVID before this summer, and we all know that we've had actually, even with the problems we've seen, we've actually had a very good summer. All of our airline CEOs I've talked to so far are actually upbeat, are quite optimistic, and actually also optimistic for the quarters to come beyond this summer season. We expect so traffic for this year to be a little bit less than what Eurocontrol had forecasted because of the infrastructure issues that we are facing, which I will say a little bit about later on. About between 85% and 90% of 2019 levels. The summer season has actually, obviously, and luckily enough, has been better, where we've had traffic above 90% versus 2019. And some of our airlines have actually performed over 100%. So actually have performed this summer over 2019. And of course, I'm talking passengers. Cargo, of course, is a totally different, a much more positive view we have there as well. So all in all, not too bad. We had our challenges during COVID, but post-COVID, as we always say, airlines are very resilient and we are very flexible in meeting the demand and in adjusting ourselves to new situations. Now, I think you know this, but I just for the sake of completeness, of course, what's going on in Ukraine with war is, of course, extremely terrible. A lot of human suffering. I think we all, as countries, we like to do what we can, and unfortunately, it looks like the war is not over yet for still some time. Now, looking at us, maybe opportunistically, what does this mean for us from an airline perspective? Of course, the airspace. The closure of airspaces to start with Belarus, remember, but then, of course, with the war, the closure of the Russian and the Belarus airspace has had huge impact for, of course, the carriers. I'm thinking about the Baltic carriers, Poland, but also this region, the carriers that have been affected by the closure of these airspaces and also the boundaries of the airspace, not in the airspace, but also the boundaries of the airspace. And those airspaces, and this is of course where this region, I would say, has suffered, but has coped very well from an air traffic management perspective. All this traffic coming from the north, avoiding the Russian and Belarus airspace, flying to Asia, for those who could fly to Asia, had to go through the corridor of the Mediterranean, including in this area. So more traffic passing by here. Now, it also means that for a lot of the northern European carriers, I'm thinking about carriers like Finnair, but also Air Baltic. For those guys flying, Finnair is a good example, for which the travel to Asia is extremely important for them to survive. I mean, they have to add up 6 hours or more for a flight from Helsinki to Singapore, which is obviously not sustainable in terms of cost. It's not nice for the passengers. They have to fly longer hours. And we have, of course, more CO2 emissions. And we see that companies like Finnair are trying to find other solutions. And they have really adjusted their business model in the meantime. But again, it is a challenge and will remain a challenge as long as these airspaces continue to be closed. Now, slots is, of course, a very popular topic. Quite complex and theoretical, but quite important for our members as well. Now, when you close airspaces and when you have to cancel flights, you fly less. Obviously, that has an impact on the 80-20 rule of the slots. You know that in normal circumstances, according to European regulation, you have to use at least 80% of your slots. Otherwise, you may be losing these slots the next season. So there's a very hot discussions on this that have been going on actually since COVID in Brussels and continue to go on at the moment. And actually, the slots regulation will be reviewed We've been told by the European Commission consultations have started. So the whole idea how the Commission wants to see slots managed, that will completely change. It will be liberalized. And you can imagine that some of the carriers are not extremely happy with that. Others actually are waiting for more liberalization. So we're up for some more interesting discussions. But again, of course, the crisis has played an important part in the whole slots management. And of course, last but not least, but of course this is going to stay for us for quite a while, the first thing that hit airlines in terms of cost, and managing that cost up to a third of the cost of the airline operation, is fuel. And of course we've seen the past couple of days the fuel price go down again. It's a lot of uncertainty, but since last year the price of fuel has increased with about 80% according to latest IATA figures. So this has a big impact on the cost, and of course the war in Ukraine has something to do with that as well. Of course there's a lot of speculation, and the overall that has an impact on inflation, which is not good for any of us. Now, we see that also, we talk a lot about sustainable aviation fuels and the fuels of the future. I mean, this increase of the fuel overall, of course, has an impact on the cost of the feedstock if you want to get more sustainable aviation fuels. So as we move forward, of course, there are a lot of uncertainties. I think you read the papers like myself every day. A lot of uncertainties because of inflation. We're closely getting to about 10%. These days, and so national politicians, but also European Commission is getting very nervous, talking about energy prices capping. For instance, in my country, in Belgium as well, it's a very hot issue. And the question is to which extent these discussions and the consumer confidence, or the lack of consumer confidence going forward, and people simply having less money, for those who are not getting raises of 10% on an annual basis, which is quite exceptional, I would imagine. The question is, how will this impact the consumer behavior? Will the passengers still fly from here to Greece, for instance, or have leisure holidays 2 or 3 times per year with these, what used to be cheap packages? Everything will get more expensive. So the question is, how will this impact consumer behavior? And of course, if that were not enough, with I could say, the recession we're moving towards, I think most analysts would agree with me. Hopefully we will not enter into a stagflation, which is of course looming as well. This is the constant, I would say, challenge that we have, and you can have more information on our website. We have a dedicated, what we call Destination 2050 roadmap website. Maybe some things about this. We all need to decarbonize, and we need to do it fast. The European Commission has the opinion, since it adopted the Green Deal in the beginning of its existence, to accelerate decarbonization, less CO2, to get to net zero by 2050. For all of us. So not only aviation, actually aviation is a relatively small part of the challenge. The bigger challenge in transport is of course automotive. They are the big emitters. They emit about 75% of CO2 emissions in the whole transport area. Buildings are responsible for 40% of emissions. Sometimes people forget, but actually the heating and the air conditioning at our homes is much more of a problem than transport. But you have to explain that to politicians. It's very difficult to explain it to a politician. Your energy prices are very high, and by the way, you need to move into a bunker because the house you have is not fully insulated, and it's not going to help us to get to net zero by 2050. Very difficult political discussion. This is why it's easier to sort of go to airlines or aviation and to bash the airlines industry. It's like, you emit too much, although we're only responsible worldwide for between 2 and 4% of CO2 emissions. So put things in perspective. But anyway, Airlines for Europe, we saw the danger of legislation coming 3 years ago, and we took the bull by the horn, so to speak, and we basically said, look, we need a roadmap. We need to be serious about how we're going to go to net zero in Europe with commercial airlines by 2050, and we need to convince the Commission that we are committed. We need a roadmap. We had NLR and SEO, specialized Dutch consultants and aviation experts, come up with a roadmap. It took a while before they get there. And most importantly, we've asked the airports, European airports, the European regional airlines, the ANSPs and the manufacturers to join us in this effort. So it's an initiative of the European aviation sector. The whole ecosystem now is involved in and has subscribed to what we call Destination 2050. Of course, it is one roadmap. Academics would argue there are many other roadmaps, But the principle is very much the same as with the other roadmaps, or with what IATA is working on, for instance. But this is really on the focused on the European situation. I'm not going into detail because you'd have a conference on this slide for a whole day. I'm not going to do that, but I'm happy to discuss this later and to take things offline. You need to know that we use this project as a lobby tool for us to make sure that the European legislation is more appropriate for its purpose. The measures you see there are the known ones: sustainable aviation fuels. Very simple, is a priority. We need to continue to blend fuels, to use drop-in fuels, because not before 2035 we will have an alternative to carbon-based fuels. Or maybe it's 2040. Airbus tells us that they will have hydrogen-propulsed aircraft ready by 2035 on the market. We still need to see that. But until then, we have a huge problem how to reduce our CO2 emissions, in addition to the other measures. And of course, you will not see aviation taxes or fuel taxes on there, because fuel taxes are not, and the Commission knows this very well, the people who need to know, are not the answer to reducing CO2 emissions to the extent that we need. Now, you say, that's all well, wonderful, technology will help us the way forward, and technology must do it. If we don't have the right technology, it will not happen. We simply cannot make it happen, at least not what the Commission would like us to do to get to net zero by 2050. Of course, this comes with a cost, surprise, surprise. And the first cost, let's just look at if airlines want to be compliant with the CEF regulation, the EU, the re-fuel regulation, that is the annual cost. So you see that it's not even cumulative. This is annual cost that by 2050, according to our calculations, it will cost European airlines more than 25 billion euros per year. Now, you say, okay, this is CEF. This is only one of the aspects of the European regulation. There are about 4 different pillars. If you look at the total cost of Fit for 55 compliance, this is the legislative package, it will amount up to, by 2050 per year, of more than 34 billion euros. Who is going to pay for that? How are we going to pay for that? Well, obviously, this is cost to airlines. We will need to work together with the Destination 2050 partners, with all of you, with the airports, with the manufacturers, even with the ANSPs, because a single European sky will save us more than 10% CO2 reduction. Why aren't we doing more about that? So we need to work all together to make sure that in a way we can reduce, we can get to the target, and we can maybe reduce the cost. Now, cumulative, because it's okay to talk about annual. If you look at the total cost for compliance for Fit for 55, it's about 576 billion euros then between 2030 and 2050, that the cost that will come to the airlines. So you won't be surprised that the airline CEOs are going through some sleepless nights, not just from today to tomorrow, but for the next couple of decades, to see how we will get there. And of course, the analysts who need to invest in airlines, who need a recommendation to invest in airlines, have another thought about this. Going back to the summer, it was a great summer, it was a very good summer. I think it could have even been better. And when I talked to Eurocontrol, the network manager, they basically said, well, traffic could have gone over 100% in some cases versus 2019 if we wouldn't have had the issues at the airport level. Let's call a cat a cat. I don't want to pinpoint, but there is a limited, a very small number of airports that have not managed well the traffic of passengers that was coming to them. We all knew very well with the Eurocontrol forecasts, which are public and everyone knows about it, what the traffic would look like this summer. Yeah? As a matter of fact, Eurocontrol had overestimated even a little bit the traffic. Yeah? So if you see that as a manager, it's public information, you say we need to get ready. If you look at airports such as Schiphol, which is the most shocking one, London Heathrow, also Frankfurt and some others, unfortunately these are hub airports. It's not a problem for Cluj, and the regional airports have done very well. But it is causing, of course, a problem for the airlines needing to connect to the regions. Yeah? So let's not forget that the hubs are also playing an important part for the regional connectivity in that sense. And of course, when you have a delay at the airport for whatever reason, if you have a delay at the airport, you have the domino effect. Delay departure, delay arrival, people needing to connect. It's a big mess. I don't have to make a drawing, and I hope that not too many of you have been in the same situation this summer where you missed flights. And it's also an issue for airlines at the end. You know, we are stuck with the passengers complaining to us. They don't go to the airport, they come to us because they have a ticket and they want the service. And they want to make sure if their flight is delayed, that they get compensated. We put them up in hotels. So the cost is adding to us. So it's not surprising that you've seen when these big airports have announced these big problems in the summer, that some of the airlines said, you know what, we're just going to have to cancel thousands of flights this summer to avoid cost. Yeah. So, and at least if we do it in advance, if the airports tell us in advance, we can cater for the passenger. We can tell the passenger, look, you can take a train, or there is a flight from another airport. We will try to help you. Management, operational management with airports has been a major challenge. Let me just quickly move on. And things, by the way, are slightly improving. But for some of the airports, for instance, London Heathrow, they said they're going to have these issues until next year. So there's still some problems to come. And again, I'm talking about a minority of airports. Let me put things in perspective. Just summarizing there, the rising operational cost we see is the fuel prices. The airport charges is also a classic one for A4E to watch very carefully. I'll just take one example, and again, this is a minority of airports. One example, Schiphol, again, interesting enough, they're coping with capacity, they cannot deliver, and yet they increase their airport charges with 37% for the next 3 years. Try to explain this to any normal business person. ATC charges, it's not only about airports, it is of course about the whole ecosystem. ATC charges, the ANSPs will try to recuperate the loss they have made in COVID. Who wouldn't try to do that? I think suppliers overall are trying to do that. But we're talking about big numbers. So as of 23 and 24, we will pay about 13% more higher ATC charges. In total, we're talking about roughly 5 billion euros that airlines have to cough up for a service which they hadn't had during COVID, and not necessarily a better service they will have this year. In terms of capacity, because there's a difference between an AT charge and then the capacity, this region here, including because of the war in Ukraine, is trying to cope. But some of the air traffic control centers, for instance, in Zagreb, Budapest and Skopje, just to name a few, will need to step up capacity efforts in this region in order to cope with the growing traffic. So traffic is growing. Let's not forget, that's good news. And this is my last slide. Just to conclude, I think I've said many things. I cannot stress enough the importance of air travel for regional connectivity, and the role, of course, of airports, of ANSPs and airlines in this. But at the end of the day, I think if the European Commission would like to cater for its wonderful projects, which they call the single aviation market, and which has been very successful with more routes and lower prices, I would say affordable prices, because I have to be careful what I say, affordable prices. If we want to continue that good project, we need to make sure that airlines can remain competitive in a healthy competitive market, which means that also regulators in Brussels, but also elsewhere, need to be careful when they tax or when they regulate airlines, that they think twice about what this means in terms of the cost impact at the end for the airline. Because a passenger, whether we like it or not, at the end of the day, will pay part of that cost as well, which means think about maybe the lack or the danger of consumer confidence in these days. Flying will become more expensive. Think about the whole sustainability efforts, the green investments we have to make. We have no choice. So flying will become more expensive. Let's make sure it can be affordable, and that we can keep up or increase the connectivity where we are in 2019. We need to work together on this, and I think this is why this conference is very good, that we put things in perspective. Airlines alone, we cannot do it on ourselves. We need all of your help, all of your partnership in order to make flying affordable and sustainable. So thank you very much.
So can I have a short question? Decarbonization. How about the other regions? Africa, Asia, America?
That is a very good question, because decarbonization is a global problem, a global challenge, not just a European challenge. I also know, on the other hand, that Europe has always want to be on the forefront of reducing emissions, also at ICAO level, at UN level. The times that we can say, or that where we are able to say that aviation has reduced its emissions over the last 15 years by about 2% because of more efficient aircraft, those days are over. It's not enough anymore. So the argument is that we are doing everything we can globally as an industry, think about the IATA efforts and at aero level, is no longer sufficient. So the other regions, that was going to be the key question to see later this month. I know also, Kostas, you're going to the ICAO General Assembly to see how the other regions of the world, I would say primarily North America, Asia, Russia, the big emitters, the upcoming countries, Asia, of course, very important, India, whether they will also commit to what we call the CORSIA, which is another abatement system. It's an offsetting system, but it's a system, I think, that would work globally to next to the European model of EU ETS to reduce CO2 emissions. So we have to see. But there's a lot of geopolitics. And as airlines executives or airlines organizations, we have not that much to say in the bigger picture. When I mentioned Russia to you, I don't have to draw a picture. You think that the Russians will be very constructive. I have my doubts. Now, the North Americans are a little bit more constructive with the Biden administration with regard to the previous administration. I think that's a plus. So I'm hopeful. And we want to go to what we call an LTAG, a long-term aspirational goal, at least have the goal to go to net zero by 2050. If we could do already that at a global level, then in principle we have the other regions with us, but the proof is in the pudding. And the difference is that Europe has a very clear legislation with very clear targets, think about the SAF targets, and possibly in aviation taxation if that's not enough. So ideally we would like the other regions also to legislate so that we have a level playing field and that they also decarbonize at the same speed as we do, but with the same obligations. The cost will always differ, that's another discussion. But right now, personally, I'm afraid that Europe is taking the forefront and is not looking back, and before we know it, we will be spending billions of euros, possibly without the rest of the world following. And of course, I'm mainly concerned about the emerging economies, because that's where most of the emissions take place. Asia, Southeastern Asia, North America, the more mature markets, they need to follow. But it's a very good question, and let's cross fingers and let's make sure that at ICAO General Assembly we get some good results to jointly reduce CO2 emissions next to what Europe is really doing already.